I'm curious if you guys want to speculate with me. I'm not talking about comic book speculation in the sense of buying books for the purpose of flipping, but what I am talking about is speculating on what could happen in the future. If you want to know what I'm talking about, stay tuned for the video. This content is sponsored by BCW Supplies. Visit them at bcwsupplies.com. Reggie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another one of my videos. In this video, we are going to play the what if game. We actually did this once upon a time, and it may have been a live stream. I can't remember if I did it as a live stream or as a pre-recorded video, but I basically played the what if game where I kind of played out if the new comic book market collapsed, what ramifications would that have on the hobby? I kind of played that out, looked at different scenarios, and just kind of asked myself, like the comic book, what if? What if it were to occur? And part of the reason for that was because at the time, there was a lot of discussion on my channel, probably because of the videos that I was creating, about a possible comic book market crash. And over the course of those videos, and certainly in that what if video, kind of what I arrived at was that there isn't one comic book market per se. Right? The best way, in my opinion, to look at it is in terms of different sectors, right? So you have an umbrella, if you will, that is comics, right? But under that umbrella are many things, right? There is the new comic book sector, which is comprised of comics, graphic novels, toys. Under that umbrella of comics, right, you also have a secondary market, which is, you know, comics that are being resold. And that could be comics that came out last week that are now being resold, but it certainly includes your copper, bronze, silver age books, you know, graphic novels that are being resold, toys that are being resold, that are not new, but being resold. And then there's also probably an original art sector, right? Because that's kind of, you know, its own thing. And then you can probably even do one for golden age as well. And part of the reason why I've kind of carved out those sectors is because to some degree or another, those sectors are motivated by different things, right? There may be different buyers and sellers within those sectors, but those sectors are kind of moving at their own rhythm to some degree or another. Because, for example, you could have a complete collapse of the new comic book market, and I don't know how much effect that would have on the golden age books, right? Which could be, you know, pre-Cold Horror and also just golden age books in general, because those books kind of move at their own rhythm, their own pace, and there are people that really specialize in that market and don't necessarily pay attention to what's happening in new comic books. That's not their thing. They are golden age people. And so I think that there is some overlap, if you will, between the sectors, but to some degree or another, they operate kind of independent of one another. So in this video, what I wanted to do was to talk a little bit about what is happening in the US and what's happening to some degree in the world. And I wanted to play out a what if. What if the market, the economy goes into recession? What could potentially happen? And right, there are an infinite number of things that could happen, and I'm only going to talk about a small portion of it. My hope is that in the comment section, you guys will kind of add to some of this stuff and just kind of speculate with me, have a little bit of fun, right? Because that's what this is about. No one knows what the future is, right? And it's just, this is all for fun. This is all for the sake of having a discussion. It's a discussion that we have all the time, right? We have it offline with each other. There's a comment here or there and, you know, in other videos. And so this is nothing more than just, you know, bringing it all together into a video for the purpose of having this what if discussion. So I would just say, you know, in the comment section, let's just keep it civil because we're just having fun, right? So what prompted me to think about this was I started looking at all of this economic outlook data, right? The thing that is freshest in my mind is the government shutdown. Right. And what prompted it to some degree is I have a buddy who is a contractor for the government, and he's in the middle of building a house. And he kind of commented like, I need the government to open back up so that I can have some cash flow so that I can actually finish this house. Because this is like a process for him. If you've ever built a house, you know that it's a process, and he's doing his own general contracting and stuff like that. So, but it's fresh in my mind, my buddy and the other, I don't know, 800,000 or so federal employees, contractors that are out of work right now, that are not getting paychecks. And if those folks aren't getting paid, they are not paying their mortgages, potentially, right? They're not paying car notes. They are not buying food. They are not, taking the money that they would get in the form of a check and putting those dollars into the economy, right? So there are some ramifications that comes from that. So the government shutdown is one of the things that's on my mind. There has been lots of tumult. I love that word, tumult, in the stock market, right? I think last year there was like some craziness that happened at the end of the year. I guess the early part of this year, I think, started out really good, but I think I saw something recently that's, talked about wiping out profits or something like that. So there was some strangeness that is happening in the stock market. When you look at the global news, you start to see, I think it was Germany, and I'm kind of referring to my notes over here, Germany and Turkey have also had some financial crises as of late as well. I don't think that they're in full like meltdown or recession or anything like that. I think they're just north of that, just shy of things being really bad. But you've got different countries around the world that are starting to be affected, and you guys know this is a global economy, right? And so what happens across the globe certainly affects to some degree or another things that happen here. And speaking of things that are international and domestic at the same time, you have the war with China, right? There was supposed to be some discussions recently between the Chinese government and our administration about, I guess, like the tariffs and trade deals and things like that. Those were like canceled. And so that, of course, had some effects on the economy. I think I saw something recently where they talked about the housing market was in like, it was the worst month in 3 years for housing. And then the Fed is talking about raising interest rates. And then, don't even get me started on the whole Brexit thing. Like, I don't fully understand that because that's some complicated stuff. My point is that there is a lot of, wait for it, tumult in the US and global economy. And so the question becomes, what does this have to do with comics? I mean, I think it has a lot to do with comics. And the reason that I say that is that when the economy itself starts to slow down, that has implications for other things. If a collector is worried about his or her job, the next paycheck, worried about what's going to happen with the values of their homes, which is for many people their largest investment, people are less likely to spend money on non-necessities, right? You are trying to cover, the food, the shelter, the water, right? You're trying to cover the basics, and you're not necessarily going out buying expensive comics, right? That's not necessarily a priority when the economy is bad, right? And that may be how like the average collector or the average person kind of responds. But as I thought about it more, what I started to think about is the not so average collector. And I'm specifically talking about like investors, right? When the economy gets bad and investors are no longer able to invest in the stock market because of the uncertainty with governments, with policies, with tariffs, with interest rates, whenever there's uncertainty in the market, that affects stocks, right? And people that have lots of money to put into stocks start to look for alternative investment vehicles, right? They start to look for options. Where can I take my money, because I have so much of it, and put it where I can make even more money, or at a minimum protect my money, right? And so what happens is when stocks and stuff get a little risky, people start to look for these alternative investment options, right? And those things are typically, I think, less liquid things. They start to look at things like real estate, for example, REITs and real estate. They start to look at precious metals, so your gold, your silver. They start to look at, I guess, precious gems, which would be diamonds. They start to look at these alternative options for where they can park their money. They are not as liquid as what you might see with a stock, but they are still a good investment vehicle, right? And so I started asking myself, is there the potential for investors, both domestic investors and foreign investors, to potentially look at comics, right? Because what we see, and there are people out there that are probably going to comment on this that know a lot more about this stuff than I. You can see the Chinese, for example, have been investing in real estate in San Francisco and California, and I think also in New York and probably other places, right? People outside of the United States that have money are coming to the US to buy things up. I think someone at one point on one of my videos commented that they have been doing a lot of comic book business with foreign collectors, which can also be foreign investors. I'm not quite certain. But my thought is this, is that if the economy, the world economy, the US economy gets bad, then you could potentially have investors that will start to look at comics potentially as a form of investment, an alternative investment vehicle. They could consider it. And there are actually articles out there that look at some of this stuff. And in some of these articles, if you read them, they actually caution investors against investing in comics. And there are lots of reasons, right? And I've highlighted some of them. Stocks are really liquid. Comics aren't necessarily liquid things. With stocks, you have the ability, minute by minute, probably second by second, to know the value of that particular stock, because you have stock exchanges to know exactly how much it's worth. Even with gold and silver, I do believe that you have indexes that will tell you the value of those things. You don't necessarily have that with comics, right? By and large, when you're talking about comics, what you have is hindsight. You know what something sold for, like, depending upon where you're looking, maybe days after something is sold, not necessarily moments, seconds after it is sold. So there's not as much visibility into the value of the comic, and you also don't have the ability to quickly sell that asset to capitalize on an uptick that you might see in the moment. And so there are lots of these articles out there that say, hey, you can do this, but you might not. And here's a couple of reasons why. And if you read these articles, they go on and on and on about all the reasons why you shouldn't invest in, like, comics and fine art and some of these other, more tangible things. But with that said, there is the potential for investors, a subset of investors, maybe younger investors, both here in the US and maybe internationally as well, that have always wanted to tap into comics to say, you know what, that is good advice, I'm still going to jump in, right? And so you could have folks that have lots of money say, you know what, I am going to jump into comics and I'm going to start buying up potentially blue chip comics, right? If you go back to one of the videos that I filmed probably maybe 2 months ago, there was an analysis that I did with a colleague where we actually looked at blue chip comics and we tracked them. I think it was over 40 some odd years. And what you saw, if you go back and watch that video, I'll try to put a link, is you saw an awesome upward curve, upward trajectory to many of those blue chip comics, right? And so if you are an investor with lots of money and you're looking at those type of comics and you're looking at those types of charts, you might say to yourself, I am going to park my money in these blue chip comics, right? Because the future looks great, right? That could happen. And so I started to say to myself, if these investors with lots of money start to park their funds into these blue chip comics, what impact could that have on us? And it really runs the gamut, because it could have a lot of influence and impact on us, and it could have none, right? Because, I mean, who knows? We're playing the what if game. So if you have thoughts on this, again, I welcome the thoughts, because we're just having a conversation. So if I were an investor and I had a ton of money, and you guys correct me, I'm probably not going to go to eBay and be on eBay trying to bid on comics, right? That's probably not going to be my gig. But I'm probably going to go to a heritage auction, a Comic Link, or some of these other auction sites out there that have these high-grade blue chip comics. Your Action Ones, right? That are going to have these awesome books that I can grab, and that's probably my means of acquisition, right? It probably won't be eBay. And so I started asking myself, what impact would that type of activity have on the average collector? What you'll probably see is that those blue chip books, you will probably see potentially an uptick in sales, right? An uptick in values of those books, because people that aren't collectors, and see dollar signs may not care about the FMV, the current FMV, right? Because we all know people can ask for it. You might not get it, right? Because if there's a big delta between the FMV and what you're asking, you're probably not going to get it. But an outside investor may not care about that. They may just decide, I see opportunity. I can't buy stocks. I don't care about this whole whatever, because they're not collectors, right? They're just going to buy it. And so you could see a rapid uptick in values of comics as a result of the last book sold. And the question becomes, does that upper end, price end, have any impact maybe on the lower end, right? So maybe they're dealing in the 9.2s, the 9.4s for these amazing books, even 9s, right? They're dealing in these high dollar, high end books. Does that have any effect in the lower end, right? Because let's talk about AF-15, right? I am not going to be at the 9.8 range, right? These investors might be. I might be in like the 1.5, the 1.8, the 2, that might be my range. That's where I'm going to play. And so the question is, if they are playing up here, driving up prices, would that have any impact on what's happening down here on eBay or in my, my low grade book area? It could. It could, right? Because if a seller is looking at that 9.8 and looking at the fact that that 9.8 AF-15 just set a new record, they could say, if that happened, if that's what they got for that, then my book surely is worth more money. So you could see asking prices go up on those lower end blue chip books because the upper end is moving. But that doesn't mean that that lower end book is going to sell, right? Because again, I don't think that these investors are going to be on eBay. I don't think they're going to be bidding on, 1.8s, right? They're probably not going to be in that range. And so you could have a lot of sellers that are trying to ask really high asking prices when the FMV doesn't support it, which means that you could have a lot of books that are sitting there unsold to some degree or another. If the economy is indeed bad, however, what you potentially could see is some softness in some of those numbers, right? You could see people that have these books, right? The lower grade books that need to sell them because maybe they're one of these federal employees, right? Maybe they don't, maybe they have, a high tax bill and they need to sell some books. You could potentially see more books hitting the market, right? You could see maybe the prices start to soften, and I'm hearing that prices are softening, but you could see potentially the prices softening even more because there's fewer people out there to potentially buy those books. Now, on the flip side, you could still have some folks that are like, the economy's bad, but I've always wanted this AF-15. I haven't bought it yet because the prices were too high. Now that there's some softening, maybe I can jump on. My point is that there is like a mixed bag of what could happen, right? If these investors come into the market, it could have some positive impacts. It could have some negative impacts. It just really depends upon, in my mind, what happens and like the duration of what actually happens, right? And what I mean by that is, let's say you have these investors come in, they pay these crazy high prices for books. The FMV doesn't support it. The economy doesn't resolve itself, right? And so these people are holding these books. They have no one to sell the book to because there's no buyers, because your average collector isn't buying it. Other investors aren't buying it because they're not seeing the returns. So there's just this mixed bag of what could happen. You could have some of these investors that are like, you know what? I've had this book. I need to get out of this book because maybe now the economy's gotten better, and they sell it and they take a loss because they don't care. It's such a mixed bag of what could actually happen if the economy continues to go bad, or I should say, if the economy goes bad. It really is a mixed bag, you know? But again, this whole thing is just this game of like, what if the economy does get bad? What do we see happening? And I want to stay away from the crash talk and the collapse talk, just because we've kind of debated that one before. But play this game with me. If the economy goes bad, if investors, both foreign and domestic, start to invest in comics, what do we think could happen in the market? What are collectors going to do? How might this thing play out? Play the what if game with me. Drop some comments into the comment section. Let's have a dialogue, right? There are, honestly, no wrong answers because we're just making it up. Anyway, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to hang out with me just a little bit. I look forward to reading your comments and interacting with you guys. If you have not subscribed to the channel, I highly recommend you do so. That way you can stay abreast of all the content that I drop every single week. Thanks a lot. Be sure to visit BCW Supplies to learn about their 950 plus products for collectors. Products include card sleeves, display cases, comic bags, storage boxes, and gaming folders, just to name a few items. Head over to bcwsupplies.com today for more information.